Hello, everybody, and welcome to the newly resurrected Compound Performance Radio. After, God, a year hiatus, Kyle and
Maybe
I have decided, was that?
maybe a year and a half.
Maybe a year and a half hiatus. Kyle and I have decided that there is enough in the field for us to rant about and short terms and short topics for us to be able to have some good discussions. So last night, Kyle put up a question and answer box on his Instagram. We actually got a few really good questions that we can look at answering on the podcast today. And none of them are going to be ones that make people angry at us. So this should be a great reintroduction to the podcasting world for everybody. So I think it'll be fun.
Yeah, never underestimate what gets people angry on the internet. But
that is fair.
Yeah, we did get a lot of really good answers. So again, we're going to kind of disperse that out over the next 6 to 8 weeks, realistically. But today we're going to talk about something that's actually a pretty hot topic, at least in our little sphere of the internet. Maybe not full internet wide, but if you found us, you're probably in a niche of some kind.
You're in that circle,
yeah,
like it or not.
You're niche, and it is what it is, and it's fine. But we're looking at the relationship between biomechanics and load management, right? And to define some terms, with this, like when we say biomechanics, we're looking roughly at just human movement, right? And we're looking at patterns, we're looking at joint movements, joint ranges of motion, pattern ranges of motion, all that good stuff. And then when we talk about load management, we're going to be talking about both external load and fatigue management, both acute within a session and globally over the course of time. I think it's kind of the best way to describe that. Do you have anything to add to that, Matt?
No. I think one of the areas where people get fairly confused in discussion of load management is looking at all of the confounding factors that go into what load management actually is, right? So if we're looking at load management, the word is kind of a misnomer because load management just sounds like how heavy are you lifting? But there's a tremendous amount of other things that go into load management, like muscle length, movement pattern itself, loadability of the movement, frequency, total session volume, total volume per week, all of these things, recovery, calorie deficit or calorie surplus, so nutrition status, all of these things are going to greatly impact your ability to manage load successfully and actually have that be a workable strategy. So one of the things that I think a lot of people seem to misunderstand is they want to remove biomechanics from load management when biomechanics and load management are really very, very, very synonymous and they work together and they're integral for each other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you can't have one without the other.
You can't. Absolutely not.
And that's part of why I wanted to talk about this, because it's almost one of these like tribalistic things on the internet where it's like you're either team biomechanics or you're team load management, when the reality of it is we're both on equal sides of the coin from that perspective. They influence one another, they're dependent on one another to a large extent. And even with all the things you just listed, that factor into that, even looking at biomechanics, right, we're also looking at individual morphology, limb length, and how that impacts your center of mass and your ability to distribute load over movement, right? So again, all of these things we tend to talk about very generally when they're actually very subjective to so many factors. And I think that's where, we should probably start the discussion, right?
Agreed.
Matt and I, as you guys know, Matt and I have very different training backgrounds, and we train different demographics, and we look at these things through very similar principles, but kind of through different lenses, I think is the best way to kind of describe it. So I think, we should probably, I want to hear your thoughts on it first, as far as like how these things integrate and influence one another, just again, from just a tacit information perspective, but also subjectively with your actual clients and within your own lifting, primarily working with like strength athletes.
Yeah. So load management is something that I, at this point, am looking at through basically almost a purely biomechanical lens. And it's something that we discuss at our seminars to a high degree, right? When we're talking about biomechanics in our courses, in our seminars, without giving too much away, the main thing that we're really looking at is we're looking at lengthened muscles, mid-range muscle actions, and shortened position muscle actions, right? So what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the exercise itself and what muscle length is that actually going to be training, right? Is that going to be a exercise to the lengthened quads, the mid-range of the quads, or the shortened position of the quads? And this is going to be an important thing for us to think about, because each one of those muscle lengths has, number one, a different adaptation that they're going to be training, and number two, a different fatigue cost associated with each one. So if we look at things like just general hypertrophy, for example, or strength training, right? We know that the lengthened position is going to be the strongest position of tissue, and it's also going to be the one that generates the most mechanical tension. But because it is the strongest position of tissue, it's the most loadable length of tissue, and it's the one that's going to contribute and receive the most mechanical tension per rep, that's also going to have the largest fatigue cost per movement and per rep and per set. So that one has to be quantified as almost more training volume than something on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the shortened position. Because where we look at the shortened position, seeing that the muscle action has the least amount of mechanical tension in the shortest position, right? Because the amount of contractile, the total distance that the contractile filaments have to travel is going to be less, and the amount of tension that they receive in that short position is so much lower. This one has the least amount of mechanical tension. It's going to have the least amount of muscular force to generate, and therefore it's also going to have the lowest fatigue cost. So what I have to look at with this when I'm looking at coaching or developing a program for any of my athletes or myself is I have to look at the length of tissue that we're going to be training and see how many, what I would qualify as like quote unquote sets per set, each exercise is going to actually end up being, right? So, and again, this is going to be a totally general metric that you're going to have to develop by looking at that person's individual morphology, and you're going to have to look at that person's individual response rates to either intensity or training volume. But when I look at something like that, I personally qualify a lengthened position exercise as like 1.3 sets per set. So if I'm doing 3 sets of leg press with like a very long pause in the bottom or something like that, that 3 sets, I would actually qualify that as 4 to 4.5 sets of quad work per week, because of the range that I'm training, the loadability of that movement, and the muscle length that I'm training. However, if I'm doing something like a leg extension with a pause at the top and I'm doing 3 sets there, I might actually only qualify that as 1.5 to 2 sets per week, per like 2 sets total, because that one might be 0.6 to 0.75 sets per set, right? So I'm looking at this, because that one is going to be training more of a sarcoplasmic thing with a lot less muscular tension towards the shortened position, the fatigue cost for that is significantly lower than the leg press is going to be. So I have to qualify those as different things in that individual training session and across the week.
So if you're listening to this, this is something that kind of, again, sounds really obvious, but honestly blew my mind a little bit the first time I heard Matt talk about it, right? So when you look at like general hypertrophy or strength templates, or you look at guidelines, right, where coaches will be like, X amount of sets per week per body part, that's very commonplace, right? Like you see that all the time. And what Matt is saying, which we have to consider, is that not all sets and reps are equal, right? Based on the mechanical positioning and the mechanical orientation to the tissues that are being stressed, and the amount of stress that you can actually put on them.
Yeah.
Process, right? So I think that's something a lot of coaches don't actually consider. I never did forever, really, until we talked about it. And I think that's something that you have to look at deeper, especially when you're looking at programming, and especially when you're looking at clients with different programming frequency considerations.
Yeah.
Right? How many times per week they actually train, because then you have to start prioritizing these things even further. If it's like a Gen Pop client or someone with limited training availability due to a sport or work or whatever, or even just being like a busy human being, like family, kids, whatever, job, whatever, right? Those are all things that, can either be really confusing, or if you understand those principles, really make your training way more efficient.
Yeah.
Right. Through that process. Right. So I just wanted to stop in the middle there and give a little more context to people listening, because
For sure.
you a lot of big words.
Yeah.
Because you know this really well. But it's a really important piece to this conversation.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I look at with this is when I'm looking at this in terms of a lens of load management, having this qualification system that I'm kind of looking at allows me to push as much volume as possible, because each one of them is going to be has a different effect on the human body, right? So if I'm looking at the general impact and the general systemic fatigue or local fatigue, which is another metric that we can talk about on another podcast. But if we're looking at the general fatigue accumulation from a leg press versus a leg extension, or from a dumbbell bench press versus a cable chest fly or chest press, where one of them is going to be training the mid lengthen range of the pec on that dumbbell bench, and the cable is going to be hitting more of that mid short position, we know that each one of those is going to have a significantly different fatigue cost. One of those is going to lead to you feeling a little bit more just generally fatigued and more centrally fatigued because the loading profile is completely different and you're training muscles at a much longer length and there's more potential for muscular damage to take place. And on the other one, you're reaching closer to more environmental failure where you're creating a negative cellular environment and you're stopping muscular contraction due to the environment that you're creating in the muscle, not necessarily due to muscular failure, right? So the contractile failure elements that you're going to reach are going to be different on each one. Therefore, we can't qualify those as the same movements, even though the general joint actions and the general movement patterns are the exact same. The loading profile is different, the force profile is different, the stimulus that those muscle groups are going to be receiving is going to be different. All of those things are going to be completely different. And if I know that, I can't, as a coach, qualify those things as the same thing. I have to categorize them separately because each one of them is going to impact my client in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that, so we kind of discussed the applications of that within like a squat pattern or a knee dominant lower body pattern.
Yeah.
Can you give an example just for everybody listening? Like what would a press example be?
For sure.
Upper body perspective too.
Yeah. So if I'm looking at something like a lengthened position
Like a
press,
yeah, like a pack.
right, like a pec dominant exercise that's going to be a very lengthened position. So if we look at what joint actions contribute to the lengthening of a pec, the lengthening of a pec is going to be shoulder extension and a little bit of horizontal abduction, right? So it's a little bit of horizontal abduction and humeral extension. Humeral extension first, abduction second.
And for the nerds there, your scaps are going to retract there also.
Yes, they are. And so what we're looking at here is a way that we can probably lengthen the pec fully is something like a dip or some kind of a dip variation, because at the very bottom, and again, dips are going to be an interesting one because of the loading profile from gravity and the human body orientation, which is going to get it to be a little bit more of a mid-range and it's going to hit the short position as well. However, if we sit out in that bottom position of the dip or something where we're allowing all of that to happen, like a big dumbbell bench or something like that, or a machine press that doesn't converge, those are going to be examples of exercises where we can really target the length and position of the pec. And those are going to be ones that are going to have, number one, generate probably significantly more hypertrophy because they're more loadable, number one. The contractile filaments are traveling through a greater total range of motion while loaded, number two. And number three, those are going to be ones that are going to have the most other muscular systems engaged with them, right? Like anterior delts, triceps, coracobrachialis, pec major, pec minor. All of those are going to be facilitating and contributing to that movement. Whereas if we look at something like a cable press around or something like that as an easy example of a shortened position pec exercise, because the shortened position of the pec is going to be humeral flexion, adduction, right? And it's going to be adduction first, flexion second. That's the way that it's going to go. So because we get extension and abduction to lengthen it, we have to do the opposite joint action to shorten it. So if I'm reaching across my body and getting a press around in here, I'm limiting the amount of anterior delt and tricep work that I'm getting because most of my joint action is going to be adduction. And I'm looking at something like that that's going to be much more shortened position of that same muscle group, right? So looking at those, the way that those exercises are going to feel when you do them is going to be completely and totally different to begin with, right? Dips are going to feel like a huge, big stretch in the pec. You're obviously going to get some work in the shortened position in the mid-range because like we talked about with the orientation of the body. However, you're going to feel a completely different stimulus when you go do that press around afterwards. And number one, the dip doesn't necessarily rob from the press around, nor vice versa. But also both of them have to be qualified as different things because they're training completely different joint actions and completely different lengths of muscular tissue, which has a completely different cost, right? So if I'm looking at doing something like dips, dips are going to be an area where I'm probably going to keep that volume fairly low because it's going to be a longer range of motion. The contractile filaments have to have to produce force for a longer total time under tension than they would in that shortened position exercise. Because in that shortened position, when I've got my torso kind of oriented towards that cable and I'm letting myself kind of rest here before I start to actually press, like I'm only loading the pec here as I get to midline and past.
Mid range to short positions.
Right. So it's only mid to short where that's even loaded. Whereas the dip, it's loaded the entire range. Right. So because the press around has to contract, the muscle has to contract, and the contractile filaments of that muscular tissue are loaded for a shorter amount of total time under tension, the amount of work that that's going to generate is going to be lower. So a dip is going to fall higher in my exercise priority than a press around is going to, unless I'm injured and I'm doing some sort of a rehab oriented program. But the dip is going to be higher, the dip is going to be heavier, and the dip is going to be lower total volume. And the press round is going to come later in the session towards the very end, sort of like a chest fly would in the traditional bro split program, as a higher volume, lower intensity exercise. And both of those are going to allow for a different stimulus for the pec and a different stimulus for the client. But looking at those, I'm not going to go 5 sets of 10 dips, 5 sets of 10 chest flies. I might go 3 sets of 6 to 8 dips at RP 8-9, and then 4 sets of 12 pec fly with a 30-second rest in between, or press round with a 30-second rest in between, to really capitalize on the different muscle lengths that we're getting here, because I know that I have to make up for that volume deficit because of the loading profile of that press around by adding more training volume.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, I think so. And I think that's a good explanation for anybody listening as well, right? Where it's just understanding stress profiles, understanding what part of the range of motion you're trying to leverage, right? And what orientation of the muscle you're trying to leverage with the exercise. And this is where, a lot of people, like, one of the bigger mistakes just general people in gyms every day, everywhere make, is with their primary lifts and their biggest ranges of motion, they usually underload those and overrep those. And then with their easier accessory work, the lighter loaded stuff, they usually overload those and underrep them.
Yeah. So
they end up kind of falling in this weird middle ground on both, where they're not training either one of them very efficiently.
Yeah.
From an adaptation perspective, right? Because that's where, again, like and I've done this too, especially with like dips, right? It's like most fit gym people, trainers, like they can rep out 15 to 20 dips pretty easy, right? But where they're probably going to be able to leverage that exercise even better is doing something like that foot supported dip with load, with like a weight belt, actual load on it, and doing lower reps,
doing something a little heavier
with a lot more stimulus, right? So again, it's just understanding, based on constraints, based on the muscle orientation and total range of motion, how to apply what stress and where to put it in your actual session. And then again, what the volume per week should actually look like. And I think that's a super helpful lens to actually look at this stuff through. Mine's a little different, but as you're talking about it, and if I look at my general programming, it actually ends up being kind of the same.
Pretty similar. Right?
Yeah. We kind of came to the same conclusion with, through different means from different ends. And that's where, for me, it's like just understanding like a concurrent based program where I'm also considering a lot more conditioning protocols per than Matt typically does. Not saying Matt doesn't do conditioning, but the total volume.
I do cardio now, everybody.
He does. And he does it really well. Way better than you would think.
I hit 10 rounds, 10 500-meter rounds on the rower yesterday at 137 split for 500 with a 90-second rest, and I almost vomited on round 4. That was good.
That's a pain cave.
That was hard.
That is not
really hard
for someone who's not like
that sucked.
Right. So this is where, for me, it's like I'm looking at this concurrently with a lot less total training volume, strength training volume per week than Matt typically is. So when I'm looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary variations of a pattern, right, I'm kind of looking at the same thing, where I'm just looking at, my primaries are going to be my high stem work. My first level of accessories are going to be my moderate stem stuff. And then my second level of accessories, or that tertiary variation, is going to be more sensation based, or kind of, again, single joint movements, whatever, towards the end of the line there. And for me, it's the same thing. Like I have to look at primaries because what's my goal with this primary? I'm looking at the most efficient force production or velocity production. And this is something Matt and I talked about, in the actual seminars we're doing on that force velocity curve, where force and velocity are at two opposite ends, and with a primary, I need to be as close to one of those ends as possible.
Yeah. I
Right.
think
So
that's a really big point that so many people miss out on when looking at training programming to begin with, is just that general force velocity relationship and trying to stick kind of in that middle ground, as opposed to, like you said, with your primary thing, you want to be at the extremes.
it's got to be very heavy or very fast, and it's got to be pretty low volume.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's going to be very neuromuscular from that perspective too. So when I look at exercise selection, like I have to consider also the most efficient constraints, right, for moving through that pattern, that desired pattern, and loading that pattern,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there, for me, and it doesn't always have to be this way. Like we're looking at probably bilateral exercises because that gives me the most potential for global load, right, or speed. And and again, when we even talk about constraints, like that's not always like free weights versus machine. That can be bilateral versus unilateral movement, right, versus alternating reciprocal movement, right? So bilateral is going to be more internally constrained because you have more points of contact with either the ground or the weight implement if you're doing like a bench press, right, than you do typically. So that's where for me it's like those primary lifts are almost always going to be my bigger bilateral exercise. And that's where I'm probably going to, sometimes even have a little shorter range of motion. Like I might use a back squat or a trap bar deadlift within those lifts rather than like an ass to grass front squat
Yep.
or an RDL, right? Because I'm worried more about total stimulus than I am about leveraging full range of motion there. For me, going into that first level of accessories, that's where I actually go into like my traditional strength work, and I can leverage these lengthened positions that Matt's talking about, um, as like the bigger lifts, and
Mm-hmm.
they being a higher total volume in my programming than my primaries, right? Just naturally because I'm looking at like 3 sets of 6 to 10
Yeah.
typically with those exercises, right? And
And
that's
that's where
where
we start getting into the difference between like central fatigue and peripheral fatigue as well, because those are completely different metrics that also contribute to load management.
100%. And that's where, again, like I'm going to work on extending a different range of motion. So I might do a front loaded squat or a cambered squat or a Hatfield squat or a front foot elevated, split squat where I can get deeper into hip and deeper into, a deeper knee flexion pattern, from that perspective. And I can get more of a lengthened glute, more of a lengthened quad through
Mm-hmm.
that process. And then when I go into that, that second level accessories, that might be where I do a leg extension or an RFE split squat or something like that, where I'm more in that short position, but I can pump out more volume, with some of this stuff. And it's going to be a much lower load profile more often than not, unless I set up more constraints for it, but that's not always the point.
Yeah.
And, this is where, when I look at, biomechanics and kind of this obsession with quote unquote optimal that we're seeing on the internet, where a lot of coaches are looking like at this optimal aspect where like all patterns should look the same. Like if you're doing a squat, it should always be the same range of motion regardless of the application, right? But for me, when I look at like biomechanics and load management, like I have to understand that intensity and the relationship between volume and fatigue are also going to alter biomechanic strategies through self-organization,
Yep.
right? So my primary squat and my secondary squat and my tertiary squat patterns are all going to show very different ranges of motion and variability within that global pattern. Same thing with my presses, same thing with my hinges and my pulls, whatever. And I think that's something, again, coaches have to consider. Like optimal is subjective to task, right? It's not subjective to a skeleton with no tissues moving passively on the table, right?
Yeah.
Or a passive range of motion test that you might perform. So I think that's something where, again, Matt and I are both looking at leveraging different positions and orientations for different outcomes. We're looking at them a little bit differently because our athletes perform different tasks and have different sport demands.
Yeah.
But the principles and the concepts there are very much the same. It's just different applications.
Yeah. And one
And
of the things that I think, just to interject really quick, one of the things that this model for both of us allows is it allows for both of our athletes and clients to train as hard as possible,
mm,
as effectively as possible. Because that's what the whole purpose of load management is, right? Load management gets a really bad reputation because I feel like a lot of people believe that all load management is just do less until it stops hurting, and then you'll be better, and then you'll go back and do it again. But that's not what load management is at all. Load management is looking at all of these factors that we've discussed in this podcast so far and allowing that to dictate your program to push as much as possible within a given capacity.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's, again, just a different way of looking at it. I think if you're only looking at load management as a deload, essentially, you're looking at like the very peripheral layer of that onion, so to
Yeah.
speak. And I think there's a lot of ways that a lot of athletes, especially like non-competitive, gym goers or whatever, from a deload perspective, like if you're programming training frequency and training volume and you're spreading it across these different, profiles, you know, in an intelligent way, week over week over week over week, you probably don't need a ton of deloads. You can just
Yep.
work through phase changes, a
Yep.
lot of the time, and just start focusing on a different training quality, right? Like if I go from an intensification phase through an accumulation phase, all I'm doing is decreasing the volume of my high stem applications, increasing the volume of my moderate stem applications, probably taking out a lot of my glycolytic work, from a conditioning perspective, just so I'm not like constantly doubling down on that system, and doing a little bit more like oxidative work and maybe a little more high stem work,
Yep.
my conditioning work, because those are going to have lower systemic stress profiles than the glyco work, and,
Yep.
and allow for a little bit more recovery and a little bit lower volume, lower intensity training
Can
time.
you explain the systemic stress profile between like ATP PCR and glycolytic work a little bit more in detail?
Yeah.
Because when we did our last seminar, that was a question that we had on the side, and I could tell by looking at the person's face that they were very offended that you said that glycolytic work is a higher total stress profile than anaerobic work. And they're like, I know.
Yeah. And I think that's where, again, like when you look at like PCR work, or, alactic power, if you want to call it that, or, whatever, it's so short duration. And again, I'm not saying it's not difficult or it's not challenging or it's not hard. It is. Really, all three of these systems are going to be challenging
Oh yeah.
if you do them correctly. Even oxidative work should be kind of uncomfortable as you're doing it, right? If it's not, you're probably not working that hard, and you might as well just kind of go take a walk at that point, right? If you're in the gym doing oxidative work, it should be uncomfortable,
Yeah,
most
I've
likely.
got some oxidative work to do today, and it's not fun.
Yeah, it's not
It's
enjoyable.
it's fun. It's fun, but it's hard.
Yeah, but if you're
Yeah.
cruising at, 130, 135 heart rate for 45 to 60 minutes, like you're
Yeah.
doing some work. Like
Oh
it's
yeah.
not it's not enjoyable, and it's not passive. Like you're having to pay attention to what you're doing,
Yeah.
as you're doing that. So, but to go back to high stem and moderate stem, or PCR work versus glycolytic work, when you look at, high intensity or high stem conditioning work, yes, the intensity is super high, but the volume is so globally low, right? Like if I'm doing sprint repeats, I'm probably only doing at most 120 seconds of work, over the course of that session. And that's high,
Yeah.
right? It's probably more so for me, more like 100 seconds,
Yeah.
80 seconds, 100 seconds. Like I'm probably only doing 8 to 10 good rounds of that. If I'm doing more than that, my performance is probably dropped off enough that ends up being a little bit like junk volume from a training perspective, right? So again, it's very hard when you do it. I'm not saying you won't be fatigued, but you're probably going to be fine training the next day. It's not
Yep.
going to it's not going to negatively impact your training moving forward. And that's where like the systemic fatigue happens, right? Where if you do something really hard and it's negatively impacting the next 1 to 2 to 3 days training, that is way higher systemic fatigue. And that's what sometimes you will get with like the glycolytic work, where now you're doing repeats of anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 minutes. at a pretty high intensity level, these are still anaerobic. Now we're just talking about anaerobic endurance or anaerobic threshold based work, right? We're also utilizing a different substrate, and the utilization of that substrate is also much more stressful on our body, right? Just not only from a muscle perspective, but even from like a liver production perspective,
Mm-hmm.
from that, and in how we're going through like digestive processes, right? So when you're getting into like glycolytic work, you're getting into occlusion, you're cleaving off more ATP, more mitochondrial work, you're increasing mitochondrial density because you're stressing just basically capacity within tissues from a blood perspective. And as you're going through that process, there's a much higher level of recovery and healing that has to take place through that, right?
Yep.
So that's where like systemic fatigue kind of takes place. So if I'm doing, 10 rounds of 90 seconds worth of work and it's still pretty hard work, that is a much higher session volume than my 100 seconds,
Yep.
right? I'm looking at what, 7 to 8 to 9 times
The amount
the
of work
total
done.
volume of work being done in the session, right?
And
So
not only that, but what were you discussing about with the average heart rate for that entire session too?
your heart rate is going to be much higher. Like when we do heart rate, analysis, because the rest periods are much higher, right? Again, if you're doing, PCR work, you're probably close to a 1 to 10 work to rest ratio, maybe even more sometimes,
Yeah.
right? So your heart rate is going to drop significantly through, and because the bouts of work are so short, it's not going to spike up that much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you're not going to get much like actual aerobic work there, because the volume is just so low, the duration is so low. So you might spike up, if you're fairly fit, into like the 150s, 160s for that little initial amount of time. But if you're doing even a 10 to 1, 15 to 1, rest ratio, you're going to come back down close to 100 to 110
Yeah.
in that interim time. If you're doing 1 to 1 or even 1 to 2 round, work to rest ratio on glyco work for anywhere between 8 to 15 rounds, sometimes your heart rate's going to be in that 160 to 170 working for the most part, and probably drop down maybe in the 130s, 140s during
Yep.
rest intervals. If you're 1 to 2 ratio, it might drop down into the 120s. But you're also going to be spending way more time at much higher heart rates through that process. So again, just way more stress, way more stimulus, not a higher output stimulus, but more stimulus from that perspective. And the recovery time and the recovery demands of that are going to say, like, if I do a glyco session on a Tuesday, I'm probably not going to be able to repeat that effort again until like Friday at the
Yep.
soonest, maybe Saturday. Again, doesn't mean I can't do a session. It just means I'm not going to have very good outputs respective to what I could have if I would have waited a little bit longer.
Right.
Now I can do an oxidative day after that just fine. Like that'd be fine. Like I can go through and do more of an oxidative day. It's not going to be fun, but that's where the concurrent model, splits, where it's not saying you're not training every day. It's just saying you're focusing on different levels of stimulus each day throughout the week to encourage better recovery and better outputs. And that's where, we'll talk about this probably on a different call, but even Matt working with Evan Pycon with Knox and talking about just the potentiation effect between your stimulus level and conditioning and how that impacts even your strength work
Yeah.
later in the week, and what that time duration usually actually includes, as far as next day versus like 48 to 72 hours, right? And what's going to be the most effective for most people.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that is always really interesting to um see is people's reactions when you talk about what you just talked about in terms of like your concurrent programming. Because if I were to tell a power lifter or a powerlifting coach that they shouldn't do a 1 rep max squat Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, they would all go, yeah, duh. Of course you don't want to do that. And then we go, okay, cool. We also don't want to do uh high threshold, high output glycolytic training Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And they go, that sounds really dumb. I could do that.
Well, and it's like,
What?
again, you think about like bodybuilders, right?
Right.
Like strength work, like your glycolytic strength work is going to be your moderate stem hypertrophy work, right?
Yep. Those are the most impactful sessions.
Yeah, and that's why bodybuilders have splits.
Yep.
And they don't train chest every day, and they don't
Yep.
train every day. Like they might hit them twice a week, sometimes only once a week, depending
Yeah.
on what they're doing, right? So they're maximizing the length of time and the length of duration between. It's all the same principle,
It's all the same.
right?
It's almost like there's only three really levers to pull on all of it. It's just intensity, volume, and frequency.
Yeah, people, again, it's like one of the things we always talk about is you can make it more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And making things more complicated is actually the easiest way to change it, right? Adding layers of complexity is super easy. Making things simpler but still effective is a much harder skill. And I think when we talk to most of our groups, like we start as simple as possible, right? Like 3 levels of stimulus, spreading it out over the course of a week. It doesn't get more simple than that for most coaches.
Yeah.
And again, you probably don't need more complex unless you've got an athlete who's very high ability and very high performance demands.
Yeah.
Because the higher ability and higher performance demands, the more specificity included, that's going to dictate a different level of programming, right? Again, specific, Jesus, I always just specificity based goals are going to lead to more specific programming.
Yep.
But if you're someone who just wants to get generally fit, or you've got, again, like a strength athlete that has to be a little bit more well-rounded, or you have a field sport athlete or a basketball player, whatever, that needs to, be pretty good in a lot of different qualities, this type of programming works really well because you can train all of them pretty much at the same time. And then if you have some seasonal need to, again, pull one lever a little harder, you can do that really easy without completely just throwing the baby out with the bathwater and negatively impacting everything else.
Yep. I think that's a good point to end on, honestly.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
I think it's a good point to end on.
Yeah, well, we're going to be doing more of these, so we'll try to kick these out a few times a month, for all of the listeners, and really what we're going to be focusing on a lot is just taking 1 to 2 topics and covering it pretty in depth with how we feel about it, how we utilize it, because application is, again,
It's our
something
bread and butter, man.
we focus on it really heavy.
Yeah.
We'll have occasional guests on here, but we really just want to talk training. That's the basis of this.
Yeah. One of the reasons why we kind of stopped doing this is because when we were doing the guest podcasts, all of our guests have been fantastic, but they all became the same podcast, and it was just the same questions that we would ask every single person. So it got just like, number one, really hard to find guests, and number two, really hard to like create a new kind of podcast with each one of those guests that wasn't just like, hey, do you also hate the same things that we hate that all of our other guests hate? And it was like, yep, I do. And it's like, great, cool. So we can end this now.
Yeah, that's so just go back a few other podcasts and listen to so and so.
Right.
Yeah, so we'll be doing a lot more of these.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you guys listening along. So again, as always, like, subscribe, follow, share, like all that good stuff. We'll also be putting these on YouTube.
Yep.
So we'll have more information there for you guys as well.
Thank you guys for listening. Take care.
Yep. Likewise. Awkward.